Welcome back to Adventures in Theater History. This is the third episode in our series, The Fight Against the Clansman. If you haven't heard Part 1 and Part 2 yet, I would recommend finding them and listening to them first. But, it's not required. As I always like to remind people, this podcast isn't school. You don't have to do all the assignments to pass the class. But I just think it would be more fun and more exciting for you to understand the complete context of what we're talking about here today. And fun and excitement is what we're all about here on Adventures in Theater History. After all, I really meant it when I came up with that title for the show. I also want to explain what I meant by the title of this particular series of episodes, because I think you should notice that it's not The Clansman, which would have been the easy thing to call it, but instead The Fight Against the Clansman. Although I had to discuss this play and its author in order to provide the full context for the story as it relates to Philadelphia's theater history. I won't spend a lot more time discussing Thomas Dixon Jr. We did that before, and there's been quite a lot written and said about him already. There are entire books and PhD dissertations about him, if you want to know more, believe me. And Dixon will, of course, come back into this story today at times. I don't want to fall into the old History Channel problem, though. You may remember back in the day when that particular cable TV network was still actually showing documentaries about actual, history. After a while, a lot of their programming always seemed to be about World War II. And not the part of World War II that happened in the Pacific between America and Japan. It kept doing programming like Hunting Hitler or stuff about General Erwin Rommel's armored warfare strategy. And, after a while, you began to feel that anybody who was regularly watching the History Channel just really liked looking at Nazis and at footage of swastikas on the sides of rumbling tanks. That was their core audience at the time. And I don't think I have catered to such an audience before, and I have certainly no intention of catering to such an audience in the future. But there's been less attention given to what I think are equally compelling historical figures, people who stood up against people like Dixon, people often who lived and worked here in Philadelphia. Though W.E.B. Du Bois, I think, certainly has been given his due, and we talked a bit about him earlier. In this episode, I'm going to try and talk about some other historical figures whose names are less well known, but even so, I can't quite give them all the time and space they deserve here in this episode. They are such compelling characters that whenever I try to tell all their life stories here, it tended to take us far away from our main narrative, because much of that history lies really far outside the bounds of theater history, properly speaking. Fortunately, as I was agonizing over this and preparing this episode, someone reminded me that I have a blog post on our website, www.aithpodcast.com, and I always put extra contextual information and images there to share with our listeners. And so that's what I've done again. And I've called this post The Learned Professions. And you should go look for it if you want to. The link is right there in the show notes for this episode. Or you can just go right to that website and you'll see the tab for the blog post at the top of the page. All right. We began in part 1 with a description of the protest against the Klansmen out on the street in October of 1906, because that's the part of the story that is unique to Philadelphia, one that would have long-lasting consequences for the way the theater world was shaped in this city. I want to talk about the people living right here who pushed back, who fought this play's message, and who were determined to ultimately prevail. So, we've established that Thomas Dixon was, frankly, a white supremacist and what we would call nowadays a troll. He was looking to provoke attention and then to fundraise and to organize off the response. I mean, he used to show up outside lecture appearances by the most famous black man in America in his day, the educator Booker T. Washington, and offered to pay Washington to debate him in public. Now, Booker T. Washington simply ignored Dixon, by the way, so that was good. But when Dixon's play The Clansman first opened for its initial run in theaters in New York City in December of 1905, just before Christmas, by the way, what a lovely Christmas spectacle. Here is what Dixon did. He sent anonymous special delivery packages by mail to dozens of leading black clergymen in New York City, as well as to prominent African-American businessmen. These packages were timed to arrive just before midnight so that they would wake these men and their families out of their beds. You hear a knock on the door, and then this man would hand you this package and then walk away. And inside, when they opened it, was this pamphlet by Dixon that we already quoted a lot in earlier episodes entitled Why I Wrote the Clansman. So what did these gentlemen do in response to this disturbing intrusion? Well, naturally, they were all justifiably angry. But then they kind of fell right into Dixon's trap, actually. That Sunday, there were a lot of sermons in New York's black churches about the evil of Dixon's racial theories, about the perils of allowing his play The Clansman to be produced at all, and there were a lot of indignant letters written to the New York Times. And of course, the Times and the other newspapers ran with more articles about this so-called controversy. The title of the play, already well known because of Dixon's novels, The Leopard's Spots and The Clansman, was now being printed everywhere. So, round one to Dixon. There was, of course, a pamphlet published by a man named Kelly Miller, a professor at Howard University, entitled As to the Leopard Spots, an open letter to Thomas Dixon, in which Professor Miller demolished one by one all of Dixon's pet theories about the supposed horrors of miscegenation and the inability of the Negro to ever reach true accomplishments of democracy and intellect and civilization. I highly recommend you find this pamphlet as a guidebook. Again, I'll put a link in the notes. It's online if you're ever in a situation where you need to argue with racists yourself. Dixon, as far as I can tell, did not really respond to Miller's pamphlet, perhaps because he couldn't. But there were live public debates held with a number of these prominent black New York ministers, just the sort of forum in which Dixon thrived. He held the floor for hours, and these meetings were well attended by large mixed-race crowds who were very angry or very curious about the entire affair. Reading in the newspaper archives all the impassioned and dignified words of the preachers who replied to Dixon is pretty inspiring, although also, in another way, dispiriting, because you can hear these same sorts of speeches today, and we don't seem to have shifted the conversation very much. I want to tell you that I am surprised that a man in this year of 1906 will get up in a public meeting and say the things you did, was actually a sentence one white man in the audience said to Dixon afterwards. But then this same man, to his credit, refused to shake Dixon's proffered hand and told him, "Oh, you're a pretty slick gentleman, you are. You're very eloquent. You've chosen a fine way to advertise your book and your play, you have." So he and other people at the time saw what was going on. But again, on the whole, Dixon clearly got what he wanted here, the response. Because although his show was only tepidly received by New York drama critics and only fairly well attended by New York audiences, he was able to leverage all this publicity for the subsequent national tours of the show. His Southern production company announced that it was sending out 2 complete Clansman casts on the road, and our old pals Claw and Erlanger announced that one of the first stops on this tour, in late April 1906, would be the Walnut Street Theatre in Philadelphia. But wait, you say, April of 1906. Wasn't the huge demonstration of thousands of people outside the Walnut, the one that we talked about in part 1, wasn't that in October 1906? Well, yeah, exactly. It turned out there was no big public reaction to the Klansmen coming to Philadelphia the first time. How could that have happened? As near as I can make it out, the story goes like this. While one touring Klansman company went out to cities of the Ohio Valley and then on to cities in the Midwest, while the Eastern Company stopped first in northeastern Pennsylvania, in Scranton, where the mayor of that then thriving anthracite coal city had refused to forbid its performances over the pleas of local black leaders. And white audiences had flocked to see it, demonstrating exactly how Dixon's publicity tactics were in fact working. A return booking was scheduled in Scranton immediately following the one in Philly. So it played in Scranton, and then it came down to Philadelphia and ran for a week, again at the Walnut Street Theatre, starting on the 23rd of April, 1906. But it was the other touring cast, the one that went out west, that was actually meeting with more resistance. A recent deadly race riot in Springfield, Ohio, had shocked many people in local and state governments, and the state legislature across the river in Kentucky had passed a bill that outlawed any performance of any play that might be, quote, calculated to inspire race prejudice. And this was apparently intended to mean both the Klansman, which upset black Kentuckians, and Uncle Tom's Cabin, which, seemed to upset white ones. Furthermore, there was a lot of sort of low-level guerrilla protest and resistance from black working-class people against the play. An actor in the cast of the Klansman reported that while he was in Columbus, Ohio, waiters at the hotel restaurant turned their backs on him, refused to serve him once they found out what play he was doing, and so did the waiters and porters on the train. So, what was happening over here, back here in Philadelphia? Didn't anyone say anything or make any protest? Well, they did, as I found out, but it didn't make the papers. It takes a little digging to find out that it happened. As we detailed in part 1, there was a fairly substantial body of black businessmen, lawyers, doctors, and clergymen in the city, and they were rather well connected to the dominant Republican Party. So the initial efforts against the play were done sort of through back channels. A delegation of these men, led by Dr. Nathan Massell, went to call on Mayor John Weaver. Dr. Nathan Francis Massell was one of the most prominent African-American men in the city of Philadelphia in that time, the first black graduate of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School and the founder and leader of the Frederick Douglass Memorial Hospital in South Philadelphia. Handsome, erudite, and dynamic, Massell was usually deferred to by others as the default leader of the African-American community, especially about all issues involving civil rights. And like most prominent black men of his day, as I said, he was a Republican, a loyal member of the party of Lincoln and of the current president of the U.S., Theodore Roosevelt, who had famously invited Booker T. Washington to dine with him at the White House. Mayor John Weaver, for his part, had alienated the Republican political bosses who ran Philadelphia by refusing to participate in a city council scheme to dole out contracts for the Philadelphia Gas Works to the usual friends and cronies. Weaver was not known for his interest in the theater arts, true, but he was devoted to proper procedure and to the law. Like Teddy Roosevelt, he was determined that the African-American citizens of his city should be fairly served by the legal system. So, when in April of 1906, this delegation of African-American men went to Mayor Weaver and asked him to forbid the local performances of the Klansmen under the powers he had in his office, the mayor was sympathetic and gave them a respectful hearing. But he asked them on what legal grounds could he intervene? To prevent unruly demonstrations and mobs endangering public safety, they replied, pointing to the long-ago example of the play, The Quaker City, back in the 1840s, as a matter of fact. In addition, they feared what might be inspired in the future by the play in Philadelphia among the city's white population. And they cited the example of a horrific lynching and the burning of a black man, which had taken place in nearby Wilmington, Delaware, just 3 years earlier. Nonetheless, replied Mayor Weaver, there are no such demonstrations or mobs outside the theater right now. Therefore, legally, he felt he could take no action. Well, the delegation went away unmollified and deeply frustrated with Weaver, but with a valuable lesson learned about what they might need to undertake themselves in the future. And so, this first visit of the Clansman just didn't really cause much of a stir in Philadelphia. Local theater critics attending opening night wrote that it was a rather poor play, and the cast was only adequate, frankly, and there were plenty of other noteworthy and sensational shows in town that week, including a spectacle called A Yankee Circus on Mars. A Yankee Circus on Mars, ladies and gentlemen. Wouldn't you go see that show? I know I would. At the Grand Opera House on North Broad Street, with a cast of 500 people on the stage. Who cared about the few horses galloping once or twice around the Walnut in the Clansman? At Nixon and Zimmerman's 5 other main theaters, there was also a much more prominently promoted shows, including Philadelphia composer Willard Spencer's new operetta, Rosalie, at the Chestnut. And anyway, the newspapers were filled with something else that week: the horrible after effects of the great 1906 San Francisco earthquake and fire. So there was plenty going on to keep everyone's attention elsewhere. No one was really too much worried about what was going on in the Walnut Street Theatre. At the end of April, the Clansman's acting company left town and made their way back up the pike to Scranton. But over the subsequent months of 1906, as that particular company spent the summer in Chicago, quite successfully by the way, while the other touring company played mainly in southern cities, news of the outrage and violence that the play was sparking in local communities kept making its way back to Philadelphia. As it turned out, black audiences in the South would attend the show, along with white ones, of course, in the racially segregated theaters of the day, and the cast of the show increasingly noticed a distinct partisanship happening out there in the House. All of the lines in the Clansman that detailed the supposedly nefarious plots of the so-called Black League to give Negroes political power during Reconstruction were met with ironic enthusiasm and raucous applause from the African Americans up in the balcony, while the many white folks down on the main floor would cheer on the efforts of the Klansmen who were fighting Reconstruction. Unrest and protests and newspaper editorials, both by blacks and white papers, were made in many cities, although the press agents and publicists for the show continued to crow about its continued commercial success in both northern and southern cities. There were these continuing outbreaks of interracial violence for various reasons throughout the country. And by September, the mayors of Macon, Georgia, and Atlanta, Georgia, as well as the mayor of Birmingham, Alabama, had forbidden the Klansmen's performances, citing the interests of public safety. Now, lynching, sadly, continued to happen throughout the South that autumn. Famous cases in Alabama and in Arkansas. And in McCormick, Georgia, on September 21st, it was reported that a white woman who was traveling by rail from South Carolina to see a performance of the Klansman in Augusta, Georgia, had her arm squeezed too tightly for her tastes by a Negro porter on the train who was attempting to help her get up the steps. This woman complained to everyone around her, and eventually an organized gang of white men came and seized the unfortunate porter, took him out off the train, and savagely whipped him 100 times before throwing him back on and telling him never to come back into town again. Other disturbing incidents took place as far north as Blackwood, New Jersey, and elsewhere near Philadelphia, although it's not always clear exactly what the immediate cause was. It wasn't all about the Klansmen, surely. But sometimes, if you search for that very suspect and amorphous term, race riot, in the archives, the stories you can see involve black violent resistance against the play, too. In Roanoke, Virginia, for instance, a white worker who was tacking up publicity posters for the Klansmen on the walls and the fences around the town, which included photos of Thomas Dixon, by the way, this bill sticker was attacked and was beaten by a group of black men, and every single poster he had in his bag was ripped up and thrown to the winds. By mid-October 1906, it was announced that soon the show would return to the Walnut Street Theatre later in the month, and ominous teaser ads began to appear in the Philadelphia newspaper theater sections. "The Clansman is coming," they read. Now, imagine you were a black reader of the newspaper. Even though the word in the title of the play was spelled with a C, not a K, this would seem more like a threat than an enticement to buy tickets. Furthermore, there was also apparently a repeat of the tactic that Dixon had used in New York City the previous year, and promotional material about the play was sent in packages to the homes of many leading figures in the Philadelphia black community at midnight. And by whom, it was never clear, but it was likely Dixon himself, or at least was done at his direction. But due to the propensity of American newspapers of the day just to let theater publicists and advance men insert copy about plays arriving in town directly into the theater columns, the articles in most major publications read like this, quote, "The remarkable business done by this play everywhere shows that it possesses a remarkable appeal to the public," close quotes. And even on Sunday, October 21st, a day before the play was to begin its second run of performances at the Walnut, the morning editions of the Philadelphia Inquirer merely read, quote, "That much-discussed play, The Clansman, comes to the Walnut tomorrow night. Lovers of American drama at its best will look forward with pleasant anticipations to this engagement, which promises to be the red-letter event of the season." Close quotes. But despite this breezy assertion, shall we call it, some people in Philadelphia clearly were not looking forward with pleasant anticipations to the engagement. Not at all. After a series of quiet organizational meetings and planning sessions, a document was released with a title on the top that read, "A Call to Action." We, the colored citizens of the city of Philadelphia, do unanimously and most positively protest against the play to be given in this city, in the Walnut Street Theatre, as announced for next week, commencing Monday evening, the 22nd instant. No agency has done more to arouse a spirit of antipathy against the Negro and to bring about a war of races than this play. Lynchings have been encouraged by this play, and because of its dangerous influence, it has been driven out of a number of cities in the South and also in the West. We, the citizens, have determined that it shall not play in the Walnut Street Theatre during the coming week. All citizens are called upon to appear at the doors of the theater on Monday night to make an effectual protest. Signed, Dr. N.F. Mussell, Reverend E.W. Moore, Reverend Matthew Anderson, Reverend G.L.P. Taliaferro, Reverend R.W. Ficklin, Algernon B. Jackson, M.D., Thomas G. Coates, M.D., H.M. Minton, M.D., William A. Davis, Ph.D., and W.M. Sloan, D.D.S. If Mayor Weaver required an actual public disturbance in order to finally take action against the Klansmen, well, he was going to get one. In part one, we covered what happened outside and inside the Walnut Street Theatre on the night of October 22nd, although I neglected to mention that Dr. Mussell himself was in the audience that night. And when asked by a reporter what he planned to do with the 2,000 men gathered outside, Mussell replied calmly, "Wait and see. If this play is objectionable to our race, we will be heard from." But before the play actually began, Mussell was asked to leave the house by Director of Public Safety McKenty, and he consented to join McKenty out on the street in order to keep order and keep things from getting out of hand. And at the end of the night, McKenty promised Massell, as well as Reverends Moore, Anderson, and Taliaferro, who were also present, that there would be a hearing about possibly banning the play in front of Mayor Weaver himself the next day at Philadelphia's City Hall. When the next day came, there was quite a show in the recently opened Beaux-Arts building in Center Square, with a delegation of 100 black clergy, businessmen, and professional leaders arriving, as well as representatives of the Walnut Street Theatre's management and dozens of newspaper journalists taking down everything that was said. Mayor Weaver met this formidable crowd in his large outer office, sitting behind a table flanked by Director of Public Safety McKenty and City Solicitor Kinsey. Mayor Weaver led off the proceedings, quote, "If it is a fact that this play incites race prejudice, it should be suppressed. All races are equal, and one must be protected as much as another. I will protect the colored citizens of this city as far as I am able. I am strongly of the opinion that this agitation was first started by the promoters of the show, and it is now evident that the agitation went too far. I have been informed that the promoters even went so far as to send booklets of the play to several of our leading colored citizens at midnight." Now, representatives of the show disputed Weaver's last assertion, and the delegation, led by Dr. Massell himself, rather dismissed this midnight delivery's importance, saying that his group was already planning to take urgent action anyway. Quote, "The play incites to riot. It is not the colored people who are the rioters," Massell declared. He then brought forth evidence that their demonstration had been entirely peaceful, that it had dispersed when it became necessary, and that the only real violence the night before had been on the part of the Philadelphia police. Most importantly, Massell stressed that this play was doing active harm to his community just by the way it was written and presented, and action needed to be taken against it. Next to speak was George H. White, a black Philadelphia attorney, who, interestingly, was originally from North Carolina and, in fact, had served as a representative in the U.S. Congress for the state. This play, Mr. White stated, was a gross misrepresentation of the historical facts of Reconstruction in North Carolina and was doing great damage to incite white men around the country to commit lynchings. In fact, amazingly, he mentioned that he had met the playwright Thomas Dixon years before, when they both were serving their first terms in the North Carolina state legislature. It had not been a pleasant experience, White said, and he recalled that Dixon was mistrusted and shunned by every other legislature, black and white, back then, and that his play should meet the very same treatment now. Quote, "The gathering of our people last night was but an expression of righteous indignation of an outraged race." After this speech, 3 clergymen, Taliaferro, Minton, and Anderson, all spoke, attesting to the insults that were being made to their community, and that there was already backlash by white people in Philadelphia against blacks that was directly attributable to it. At one oyster warehouse on Dock Street, for example, the white workers who had either seen or had heard about the play had gone on strike, demanding that their black co-workers at the oyster house be fired. Fortunately, and to his credit, the owner of that particular business refused to do so. But still, that was what was going on at the time. Then, the representatives of the theater itself had their chance to protest that the play contained no matter insulting or injurious to the reputation of black people in general, and certainly not in the city of Philadelphia, an assertion so patently untrue that Mayor Weaver quickly dismissed it out of hand. And after just a few short minutes, the mayor issued his ruling. The play known as The Clansman tended to incite racial hatred and animosity. It was a threat to public peace and safety, and from that point on, it was to be banned from further performance in the city of Philadelphia. It could never be done there ever again. Of course, the theater managers and the representatives of Nixon and Zimmerman immediately appealed to a Philadelphia city judge for an injunction to stay the mayor's decision. Thomas Dixon himself, by that point, had arrived in Philadelphia and attempted to sway the court with his usual line of palaver. But the two local judges hearing the case immediately rejected his pleas and refused to overturn the ban on the play. Police were then dispatched to stand in front of the Walnut Street Theatre again that evening, but this time to turn away all people who attempted to enter the doors, mostly, as it turned out, irate ticket holders who apparently just hadn't gotten the news yet that the show was canceled. And, reported the Philadelphia Inquirer, quote, "Negroes in all sections of the city were jubilant last night over the action of the mayor and the courts on their behalf." And indeed, in the long run, the ban against the play in Philadelphia held. Some other big cities' mayors followed suit, although, of course, most did not. The play, The Clansman, continued to make big profits for the producers and for Thomas Dixon Jr. All I can say to console you about that is that Dixon apparently was a bit of a fool with all of this money that he earned. He invested it quite rashly and immediately lost it in the stock market panic of 1907. He actually lost control of the play itself as a property. And when another producer attempted to bring it back to Philadelphia, to the Chestnut Street Theatre in 1910, it was stopped again after giving just one performance. But, and I know many of you are thinking this now, what about Birth of a Nation? Doesn't this play, The Clansman, get made into that infamous D.W. Griffith movie? Wasn't it openly supported by Thomas Dixon's old college friend, now the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson? Was the ban against the play in Philadelphia also applied to the film when it came out in 1915? Well, yes, it was, but only briefly. And then the ban was quickly overruled, and the movie ran for 3 solid months at the Forest Theatre on Broad Street, as well as everywhere else in America. But, we're going to talk about that in our next episodes. Because although I would agree, the banning of the play, The Clansman, was a victory for political decency and public standards in the city of Philadelphia during a period of otherwise really appalling racial discrimination and endemic violence against black people, on the whole, this new tendency to demand that local governments police the contents of plays on moral and political grounds was going to take some surprising turns over the next few decades in Philadelphia. This particular battle was won, yes, but a whole new war had just opened up. We're on the cusp, ladies and gentlemen, of the era of censorship. But that's all for today. I'm Peter Schmitz. Our theme music and sound engineering are by Christopher Mark Colucci. Thank you once again for your kind attention. Please check out our social media feeds on Facebook and Instagram. Please visit our website, www.aithpodcast, for additional images and the blog posts and information, and to listen to earlier episodes if you need to. And then, and this is important, like us and subscribe to our feed on whatever platform you are using to get your podcasts. And then, of course, we ask you again, please, please, please leave 5-star ratings and write a brief review of the show on Apple Podcasts or on Overcast. Most of all, we ask you to please join us again in a few weeks' time for the next adventure in theater history, Philadelphia.